Today, we're going to Zimbabwe. Now, your first question probably is something like, where is Zimbabwe? Well, Zimbabwe is in southern Africa. It's just north of South Africa. It's landlocked. And Zimbabwe is kind of an interesting and odd name for a country. For that matter, the flag has got a bird on it that looks a little bit odd too. We'll be coming back to the bird and the name Zimbabwe in a second. Now, you may know Zimbabwe by an older name, Rhodesia. And Rhodesia is also an odd name for a country. You might think of it as being something that sounds like it should be an element on the periodic table. You take a pound of Rhodesia and mix it with so-and-so. But Rhodesia is named after Cecil Rhodes. Remember that name, Cecil Rhodes, because we're also coming back to it. This old map was drawn in 1541. And it shows the area of South Africa that was known in 1541. And in 1541, all of those little places along the coast that are listed are Portuguese. And the reason is because it was the Portuguese that were going around the Horn of Africa. And they were the first ones making settlements there. That little king that's on the boat going past the Horn of Africa and headed towards India. Well, that's the king of Portugal on the map. The reality, of course, was it was Vasco da Gama. He was the first one to make that trip all the way to India, and he actually made it a couple of times. But Vasco da Gama is not the person that we're most interested in talking about. Instead, it's someone else that was on his second voyage, and his name was Tome Lopez. Tome Lopez was a scrivener, by which we mean that he could read and write, which was somewhat unusual in his day. As a ship scrivener, he wrote down the chronology of the trip, basically. But after his second voyage, after the 1500 second voyage, he was in South Africa, that is, Southern Africa, specifically in an area that we now know as Mozambique. You see, there was a little bay called Sofala in what is now Mozambique, and that was the place that they would likely put in after rounding the Cape in case they needed to do repairs. And so there was a Portuguese station there. And from that location, he found out a little bit about the interior of Africa. In 1505, he heard reports about a stone complex in South Africa or Southern Africa. And this stone complex was unlike anything they had ever seen in sub-Saharan Africa before. As a matter of fact, it looked Middle Eastern. Now that's important because Lopez started thinking about what this could possibly be. And the conclusion was that the natives had not built it. Instead, some foreign organization or country had gone in to Southern Africa and built this stone complex. It's really sort of a city or expanded royal court, if you will. In any event, he decided that that complex was Ophir. Now, if you're familiar with the Old Testament of the Bible, you'll probably recognize Ophir.
What are you reading?
The mystery of King Solomon's treasures. King Solomon's mines are a part of ancient history.
Like Captain Kidd's treasure, or Atlantis. Right, Quatermain?
Something like that.
Don't let him fool you. Quatermain believes in the mines. He even tried to find them once.
Really?
I was a kid.
Ha! You were almost 30?
It was years ago, and I never found one shred of evidence that proves that the mines exist.
Aye. Well, a good story is still a good story. Why don't you tell us about it, Miss Maitland?
Why not? It'll pass the time.
Aye.
Well, according to the biblical accounts, King Solomon ruled Judea for 40 years. He was supposedly a very wise king who united the lands around Jerusalem into a single country. And he built one temple to the one God of the Hebrews. It was to rival all the grand palaces of Mesopotamia and Egypt. So he sent his men to the far corners of the world, and they found a place where it was said the ancestors of the ancients buried a huge treasure trove of riches of every kind. Diamonds, gold, emeralds, rubies. This place was called Ophir. And on the return, these riches were used to adorn King Solomon's temple, and nothing in the world rivaled it. However, it is said that only a small amount of what the men found in Ophir was actually used in his temple, and the rest is yet to be found.
Now, what you've heard about Ophir is not entirely correct. It wasn't a treasury. It was a mining operation for as far as we know. And we know that there was a considerable amount of gold taken out of Ophir. At least that's what the Bible says. In 1 Kings 9, it says that they brought out 420 talents of gold. Now, 420 talents of gold is kind of a vague number because we're not sure just exactly what a talent was in terms of weight. But the guess is that it was about 75 pounds. That means that 420 talents of gold would be about $1 billion worth in today's money. Then later on at verse 14, it says, "Now the weight of the gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold." Well, that's about $1.5 billion worth of gold in today's prices. But the kicker is here. Down in 1 Chronicles 27, it says, namely, 3,000 talents of gold, of the gold of Ophir, and 7,000 talents of refined silver for overlaying the walls of the house, that is, the temple. In terms of the gold, that's $7.2 billion worth of gold. And for as far as the silver is concerned, well, that's a mere $200 million worth of silver. Now, was this reasonable? Was Tomé Lopez's conclusion that this was Ophir reasonable? Well, one of the things that we know from the Bible is that it took 3 years for the ships leaving Israel to get to Ophir and come back. Now, does that make sense? Well, in fact, it probably does. The ships were piloted by Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians had, during the time of Necho II, a little bit later, circumnavigated Africa. It took them 2 years to do that. So in 3 years, you could go down to Ophir, if it was in southern Africa, do some mining or some bartering, and then come back to Israel. That makes sense. For that matter, you could also go to India or maybe the Philippines for as far as that goes. In 3 years, you could go just about any place in the old world with Phoenician ships. Now, one of the things that's interesting about Zimbabwe is that there have been Roman coins found there. Now, the fact that there are Roman coins found there doesn't mean that there were Romans there, but it's very interesting. These coins are all first and second century coins, and it turns out that the Romans did have several expeditions into sub-Saharan Africa. One of them, there was a Roman that went from Leptis Magna, which is where Tripoli is today in Libya, and he goes across the Sahara Desert with the Garamantes, which was a Berber tribe that was allied at the time with the Romans. And he gets into sub-Saharan Africa. We know he's in sub-Saharan Africa because there he captures a rhinoceros and he takes it back to Rome and displays it in the Colosseum. It was top billing. That's not the only trip. There's also been at least one down the west coast of Africa, probably down to Senegal or so. And there was a very interesting trip up the Nile. During the time that Nero was in charge, he sent a detachment, probably a squad, of his Praetorian Guard up the Nile River to find the source of the Nile. Now, we're not sure how far they got. I suspect that they only got to southern Sudan, but a lot of people believe that they made it to Murchison Falls because of what they described there. Murchison Falls is all the way down in Uganda, and that would mean they could have discovered Lake Victoria. Pliny the Elder and Seneca the Younger both tell us about the Praetorian Guards. And one of the things that we see is that it's possible that Nero was planning an invasion of Ethiopia, and that's why he sent the Praetorian Guards down there. But by the time they got back, it was near the end of Nero's reign. Nero's reign, you'll recall, was cut short, and that terminated the invasion. But what really got Tomé Lopez's interest was that they were mining gold in this area. Lots of gold. As much as 25 or maybe 40 tons of gold a year. Perhaps over a period of many, many years, they might have mined as much as 500 tons of gold. Shona people did do gold mining in this area. They did it the same way that the ancient Romans, and for that matter the Egyptians and the people in the Indus River Valley did it. Basically what they were doing was mining quartz. And then they were crushing the quartz. Now in order to crush the quartz more easily, one of the things that they would do is they would burn the quartz to make it more friable. Then after it had been reduced to kind of a powder, they would wash it and get the gold out. That's the way it's almost always been done. Incidentally, the picture over here was done by Thomas Baines, and Thomas Baines was an artist that was going around the countryside in the fairly late 19th century doing drawings, and several of the drawings that I have of the Matabele and the Shona were done by Thomas Baines. This shows them crushing the quartz. Although there was substantial gold mining going on, individuals didn't collect very much because of the primitive nature of the mining. And so the individuals usually put their gold in porcupine quills, which they hid in their hair. Great Zimbabwe is very extensive, and incidentally the country of Zimbabwe is the only country named after an archaeological site, this site. There is a citadel, which is presumed to be a royal residence or fortress, and the king is assumed to have lived in this particular location. The construction is entirely of stone, but it's not the classic stone that you see in Egypt or Greece or Rome. It's a rough kind of stone, but there's an awful lot of it. In the valley below the royal citadel, there's a large enclosure, and from a distance it's a little bit difficult to tell how large the enclosure is. This is the front gate, but up in the top of that there's some wood, and early archaeologists said that that wood was from the cedars of Lebanon. Well, it turns out that it's not. These pictures are of the Great Tower. This is probably the most recognizable thing in Great Zimbabwe, and almost all of the reconstruction drawings emphasize this particular tower. It's very impressive. It's difficult, though, from these photographs or from any of the photographs that you see, really to tell how tall some of this structure is. So my guide is going to be shortly walking down a passageway between two of the walls. One of the things that you're going to notice is that those walls are quite tall.
Okay.
But what really got people excited was a collection of soapstone birds. And those were really very impressive to the Victorians. This is the bird that's on the Zimbabwe flag. I've already told you a little bit about Great Zimbabwe. This is my guide, Leftmore. So, where are we right now?
We are in the Royal Cave.
And which is where?
The Royal Cave is actually is known with 2 or 3 names. They call it the Royal Cave, some call it Ceremonial Cave, some call it the Ritual Cave because of the multi-functions of the cave. Entrance to caves like this is regarded as an entrance into the ancestral spiritual world. So the king and his guards and other inner cycle members would come here for ritual meetings.
And this is part of the royal enclosure, yes?
Exactly, it's part of it.
Okay. Now, I remember a story. In 1505, Tomé Lopez, who was a scrivener for Vasco da Gama, he was in what is today Mozambique, and he heard rumors about a great building, stone building, and the stone buildings in sub-Saharan Africa are very rare. In fact, at that time, considered non-existent. And Tomé Lopez also knew that they were mining gold in this area. So he came to the conclusion that this was King Solomon's lost mine, Ophir. Is the lost mine in this area?
Where is the last mine in this area?
Is it in this area?
Okay. Wow, I get it.
Is it?
Yeah, I only know of João de Barros. He was also Portuguese. Who actually came to the place around 1552.
Okay, so probably Tomé Lopez learned about it from him.
Maybe, most probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, could be possible. Or maybe it's vice versa.
Perhaps.
Perhaps. I'm not very sure. The problem is the Portuguese documents were written mostly in Portuguese, and they were writing mostly on assumptions. They never had any proper documentation. That's why they never allowed into the European communities to visit this place. But they wrote about in their diaries that there's a place called Zimbabwe, but it was supposed to be Zimbabwe. The thing is, the language was a barrier. So they were taking assumptions. So the way they hear it and the people were pronouncing, it was something different.
Okay. So when was this building, the Great Zimbabwe, built?
Around 1200 AD.
Well, King Solomon was 1000 BC.
Yes, so there was a huge difference. It didn't make any sense.
So it can't be built by King Solomon or anybody in his time period.
Exactly.
Okay, how do you know that it was built over 1,000 years after King Solomon, 2,000 years after the King Solomon?
Most of the artifacts we rely on here, we mostly rely on archaeological findings. And these have been dated.
How?
Which is scientific. You know, like the pottery, they do thermal dating, like the bones and etc. This is more scientific.
How do you do the dating on the bones? Do you know?
They actually put in a machine. They actually know the carbon accumulating. That's the carbon dating. Then they actually can tell that the date. It can not be so precise, but it's closer to the truth.
So all of the carbon dates are AD, not BC, is that
not
correct?
Not BC, that's very correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they do gold mining in this area, yes?
Yes, they did. And further confirmation is that the people were visiting the place, they hear about the place when it was still very vibrant, from AD, from like 1505, 1552 respectively.
How early did they do gold mining in this area?
As early as 1150 AD.
AD?
Yes.
So King Solomon in 1000 BC could not have been getting his gold from here because there was no gold mining, is that right?
That's very true. The place was not occupied by anyone. There was very few people who occupied this place, only around 5 AD, who happened to be the Bushmen people, were staying in very smaller numbers. And when the Shona Bantu people were coming around, these were displayed in deserts and stuff, where you find them even today.
And how do you know how early the gold mining began?
Well, actually, this have been found out because of the traders who were coming here. Remember the decline of Mapungubwe, which is predecessor to Great Zimbabwe, I actually gave rise to this place because of gold mining, because gold was fetching more value in the world market than ivory. So that's when they actually introduced the site and started booming. It was because of gold mining.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the gold mining started because the traders were coming in. The traders weren't coming in because the gold mining started. Is that right?
It's a bit tricky. It's a bit tricky, but I would like to think that settling here was because they were closer to gold sources, which was a thing the traders were actually looking for.
Okay.
So the traders didn't come in here; they were coming for gold.
So you're certain that King Solomon wasn't getting his gold from this area?
And this place is not even Ophir. Never have that name of Ophir.
No. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
So radiocarbon dating on materials found underneath the walls of Great Zimbabwe and in the mines don't support any evidence of activity during King Solomon's time. Well, if the Queen of Sheba didn't build Great Zimbabwe and Solomon didn't, nobody of that ilk, who did? Well, the next best candidate for the job, according to the Victorians, was the Limba people. The Limba people of Zimbabwe and South Africa look like their compatriots, but they follow a very different set of customs and traditions. They don't eat pork. They practice male circumcision. They ritually slaughter their animals. Some of their men wear skull caps. Until recently, they didn't intermarry, and they put the Star of David on their gravestones. Their oral traditions claim that their ancestors were Jews who fled the Holy Land about 2,500 years ago. Now, about a decade ago, some British scientists carried out some DNA tests, and they have confirmed their Semitic origin. These tests back up the group's belief that maybe 7 men married African women and settled on the continent. The Limba also have a sacred prayer language, which is a mixture of Hebrew and Arabic. But as to the DNA testing, more recent testing has thrown cold water on the Jewish origins of the Limba. It's simply in doubt. The Limba people also claim to have the lost Ark of the Covenant. This is it. As you can see, this is a reconstruction. It's basically just a drum. These are more traditional drums. You can see that they've got rings on each end for carrying. So this is not terribly unusual, but it is the oldest wooden artifact in sub-Saharan Africa. But of course we know it can't actually be the lost Ark, because we know that the lost Ark is actually not lost. It's in a government warehouse someplace in New Mexico. For that matter, we also know that Great Zimbabwe wasn't the only large stone structure, although it was the largest stone structure in sub-Saharan Africa. This is my guide, Paul. And Paul, where are we?
We're at Dlodlo ruins, also known as Danangombe.
And why are these ruins interesting?
Many reasons, but first and foremost, they are also romantically known as the last capital of the Rosvi people, and indeed were occupied for a couple of centuries before being the people being conquered by the Matabele in the 1830s. They're one of the finest examples of stone walling that we have in Zimbabwe, with many beautiful patterns and decorations built into the walls, and also have been the site of many quite fascinating and intriguing archaeological discoveries, including at various times a lot of gold ornaments and artifacts, various imported foreign goods, including, quite excitingly, some brass Portuguese cannon, and a lot of other, really, really intriguing things that gives us a very good idea of the history and development of this place.
Well, you said that this was the last capital. What was the previous capital?
The previous capital was a place called Kami, which itself is a World Heritage Site. And that had been established much earlier than where we are now, sometime in the mid-1400s, by the Torua people, who themselves are then conquered by the Rosvi, who then have a bit of a civil war between themselves, and the kingdom splits. And the winners move up here and build Danangombe.
Now, if I remember correctly, there were two brothers that were fighting over the kingship for the Civil War. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, we don't know their names or much about them, but what we do know is that we had the older brother and the younger brother vying for the kingship, and the younger brother thought he should have it, while the older brother thought he was the rightful heir. So they have an initial scuffle between them, which the older brother wins. And instead of sending his younger brother off into the hangman's noose, as you would say, instead he sends him off into exile. And the younger brother marches north, meeting up with a band of Portuguese mercenaries and somehow convincing them to throw in their lot with him. And they march down, amassing a huge army behind them, and invade and conquer Kami in around 1644. And the Kami itself is destroyed in the fighting. It's burnt to the ground. The Portuguese mercenaries, as part of their payment for their work, loot the place,
Yes.
and then march back to the Zambezi Valley. So, some very unsettled, difficult times that then leads to the state splitting, and the larger remnant establishing themselves here where we are right now.
Okay. Was that the older brother or the younger brother that ends up here?
Oh, it's the older brother who moves himself in here. The younger brother is left to enjoy the ruins of what he had once coveted.
So he gets what he deserves, in a sense, maybe.
I think that's the kindest way to put it.
So the Portuguese, what was their relationship with this kingdom?
It went up and down. At times they had very diplomatic relations. They actually had the equivalent of ambassadors actually visit this court with gifts and good wishes and all the rest of it. But after a time, the Portuguese thirst for gold, a lust for it in fact, soon overtakes them, and indeed the relationship switches to become a very, very violent one. And the Portuguese themselves actually try and mount several punitive expeditions into this area to try and take physical control of the mines, and they're not just pushed back, they're eliminated. And we actually have evidence of a large-scale war that takes place between the people in this area, much further north of us as well, towards Harare, that whole area there. And the Portuguese, those who survive, flee to the coast, but everyone else, including women, children, the elderly, are all killed off. And the Portuguese never ever returned to the interior until the 1890s, so over 150 years later after this massive war. And that's part of the story of the scramble for Africa.
Now, as I understand it, Rosvi means something like the destroyers. Have I got that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. In that case, maybe the destroyers end up destroying themselves. Is that right?
Yes. The destroyers, the nickname comes from the fact that when they first emerge into our history here, they are a ruthless, formidable army led by a very, very charismatic leader known as Changamire Dombo, which itself is a dynastic title that's used many times by people in our history. But this particular Changamire was an exceptional soldier, and so they move into this area and they conquer the local people, most especially the Torua, before they know what's hit them really. And so, the Rosvi themselves are settled down here until they go to war with the Portuguese, which also greatly weakens the Rosvi kingdom as well, because so much resources and people are expended in this war, it leaves them vulnerable to later invasion and conquest by others.
Okay. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Now this next scene is of Cecil Rhodes talking to one of the other directors of De Beers, the Diamond Organization, and he's trying to talk him into essentially mounting a military-style campaign to go up into the area around Great Zimbabwe and start gold mining.
De Beers, and no one is going to play Julius Bleeding Caesar or friggin' Napoleon with my money! Is that clear? I'm a businessman, Mr. Rhodes, not a bloody emperor!
That's all right. Let's talk as businessmen. Kimberley, virtually all the world's diamonds. The Witwatersrand, the greatest goldfields known to man, and a mere 300 miles between them. Now, it would be contrary to nature, wouldn't it, to suggest that in all this vast emptiness there is nothing whatsoever. There could be another 50 rands, another 100 Kimberleys. Where's our precious monopoly then?
Look, I'm not here to talk bloody ifs and maybes.
No, nor I, Barney, nor I. Let me show you something. Has anything like this been seen before in Kaffir country? Has it? Barney, we have it on the authority of the Bible that somewhere here lies a lost kingdom, the biblical kingdom of Ophir. The site of King Solomon's mines, the source of the Queen of Sheba's riches.
Blooming unbelievable.
No, listen to me. Now, this carving was found in a country called Mashonaland. It's the territory between the Limpopo and the Zambezi. Taken from a great and ancient stone city. And all across Mashonaland, wandering hunters have found ancient mines. Groves of lemon trees, pomegranates, things unseen in Africa. And each new discovery supports the legend. Mashonaland is, in my firm opinion, the lost kingdom of Ophir.
So we just, gets ourselves an army and ups and takes it. What do you reckon about what? Million Schwarzers dotted about in there? No problem sorting that lot out.
We don't have to sort it out. It's already been done for us. A generation ago, a huge Zulu army, the Matabele, swept through this territory and established their headquarters at Kwabulawayo. Their ruler is a king called Lobengula.
Remember the Matabele. They're next. The first time that I ever ran into the term Matabele, it was in regard to ants. There is an ant called the Matabele ant. It's named after the tribe we're going to be talking about in a few seconds. It's a very aggressive ant, and it specializes in termites. This is a Matabele ant nest, and usually they'll have sentries out front, and they have a couple in this particular case. Did you hear that? The ants make a peculiar sound. Sometimes they're called hissing ants because of that sound. If you blow on the ants, you can usually get more hissing. Now what we're going to do is we're going to get a piece of straw, and we're going to see if we can't aggravate the Matabele ants a little bit to see if they'll attack the straw. worker ants are attacking the straw, but I didn't see but only one soldier, and this led me to believe that maybe the soldiers were out on a raiding party with most of the worker ants. I'm going to move now to put an endoscope down into the ant nest and see what happens. Unfortunately, my cameraman is not familiar with the camera that he's operating, and he fiddles with it a little bit too much. But you can see that I've got a black box in my hand, and that's got a screen on it. And that shows me what the endoscope sees. At the end of that blue wire, there is a camera. And in addition to a camera, it has its own lights. This is what the endoscope sees. Of course, eventually the Matabele ants discover the endoscope and decide to start attacking it, and that's what this next scene shows. Now, you might be under the impression that these ants are pretty good size, and they're not small ants. The soldiers are about 7 millimeters or so in length, and the workers probably about 5 millimeters. Well, now I've overdone it. The ants have concluded that they cannot defeat the endoscope, and they've decided to abandon the nest. So I pulled the endoscope out, and the ants settled back down and moved the larvae back down into the nest, and I think everything is okay now. I think they're going back inside. The Matabele ants are named after the Matabele tribe, which we're going to talk about later. And they originated not so much in Zimbabwe as further south. They're a splinter group of the Zulus. They were fierce warriors, mounting raids on other tribes during the 1800s. Now, Matabele ants normally feed on termites, and in order to find them, they will send out a scout in search of a termite nest. Once one is located, usually within about a football field length from the ant's own nest, the scout will return laying a chemical trail, and the raiding party then follows. This is the scout. Now these are termites. It's exactly what the Matabele scout's looking for. This is lunch for his nest. Now, this termite nest, we've actually broken into so that you can see the inside of it, and we're using the endoscope. And you can see that immediately a soldier termite came out. He's the one with the big head and the pincers, to see if there are any invaders here. And along behind him are reinforcements and a bunch of worker termites as well. Now you can tell the worker termites because they don't have the big heads and the big pincers, but also because the worker termites are, for the most part, carrying small pieces of mud in their mouths, and they're going to try to seal up the hole that I've created so that their fortress is back intact. Incidentally, although termites and ants look pretty similar, historically, that is, evolutionary-wise, ants are basically wingless wasps. On the other hand, termites are a type of wood roach. Now this is a Matabele ant raid. Now they can send out raiding parties up to around 1,000 strong. These raids are conducted in columns of ants, usually marching 2 to 10 abreast, with the column reaching 5 or 6 feet maybe in length. The raid itself is a exercise where the Matabele ants can use their sting to paralyze the termites. They then drag them to the surface if they have to and pile them up, and once the hunt's over, the ants gather up their prey and take them back to the nest. Larger ants actually can carry as many as 12 termites at a time. Now, rather than raiding a termite colony to extinction, the Matabele ants usually sustainably hunt so that they can return time and time again. Now this may look like a lot of ants to you, but in the ant world, these nests are relatively small. The Matabele don't number as many ants as maybe a nest of siafu, or sometimes called driver ants or safari ants, or South American army ants. The result is they have to be very careful. And when one of their members gets injured, as we're about to see, the other ants will come to its aid and take it back to the nest where it is rehabilitated. We're going to be moving now from the Matabele ants to the people of this area. And we're going to start with a little background, a little historical background as to how they got here and when. The Matabele are a Zulu-speaking tribe, and the fact is that Zulus are a Bantu group. Bantu is similar to saying that English is an Indo-European language. Zulu is a Bantu language in the same sense. The Bantu began up someplace in the Sahel, just south of the Sahara Desert. At this point, they seem to have split, one group going to the east near the Indian Ocean, and the other one going to the west along the Atlantic. Now, these people were agriculturalists. They were farmers and ranchers, and that's much different from the people that were originally here. Now what this shows is that the Bantu didn't reach this area until maybe about 1,000 years ago. But about the only people that were here in Zimbabwe before the Bantu came were the Bushmen. And about the only thing that they left behind were these paintings. They were hunter-gatherers, and the paintings do reflect that. I assume that they tell a great story. But apparently the English translation is now out of print. The Matabele, the tribe, not the ants, are a Zulu-speaking people, and as a result, they're part of the Bantu language family. But that also means they are basically cattle raisers. This is the African cowboy tradition. This painting is of a Matabele warrior done by Thomas Baines. You remember Thomas Baines, in the late 19th century. The Matabele don't call themselves that. They call themselves Indabele. But the Matabele is the term we're going to use because that's the term that the British used. The British actually learned the name of this tribe from other tribes that had run into them. The term appears to be a combination of Sotho and Tswana. You know about the Tswana. After all, Botswana is the land of the Tswana. So you've run into that term before. The Ma in the Matabele indicates that it's a group. The rest of the word means tall shield. They're a Zulu people, but they're not part of the core Zulu group. Back around the early 1800s, the Matabele were just another Zulu tribe. And Shaka Zulu came to power, and he turned the Zulus into Africa's best fighting machine. And he started engaging all of the tribes around him and beating them severely. The Matabele were part of that and assisting Shaka, and then there was a falling out. The Matabele started doing raids that Shaka Zulu had not authorized. And eventually Shaka was embarrassed by the fact that they weren't paying attention to him. And so he sent a regiment of his troops up to put the Matabele in line. His regiments are called impis, and there probably were about 3,000 warriors in that impi. The Matabele, on the other hand, only had about 500 at the time, but they were back up in the hills and they were on their own turf. And they defeated Shaka's regiment. They're the only African tribe that ever defeated Shaka in battle. Well, Shaka was now so embarrassed that he had to send his best troops, his veteran impi, the Ufasimbi, up after the Matabele. Now, by this time, the Matabele only had about 300 warriors, and they weren't about to go up against the Ufasimbi regiment. So they left. They got outside of the area that Shaka was controlling, and they headed up close to Pretoria. Now, it's there that they run into the Boers, the Dutch people that had been in South Africa since around 1600 or so. And it's at that point that the Matabele become very acquainted with Western weaponry. They took quite a beating there, and they were forced back across the Limpopo River. Once they got across the Limpopo River, there was a dying civilization there called the Rosvi Empire. It's a Shona group, basically. But the Rosvi means destroyers. They got started probably around 1700 or so. And within about a century, they basically destroyed themselves. In any event, they were greatly weakened by the time the Matabele got up there and made contact with them. The Matabele took lots of prisoners, almost all women. As a matter of fact, I've been told by the locals that if you want a nice-looking girl today, then you need to go to the Matabele because they've got all the good genes. In any event, the Matabele settled in what is now mostly Zimbabwe, pushing a lot of the Shona either out or under their control. Now we're moving into the late 19th century, and I want you to take a look at this map. Take a look at how much territory the Zulus have in the south and how much more territory the Matabele are actually occupying up in what is now Zimbabwe. It's really extremely impressive when you keep in mind that the Zulus were the major powerhouse in southern Africa. Now today, if you visit Zimbabwe, you're likely to be visiting Matabele land, that part of Zimbabwe that the Matabele occupied, and the reason is because that's where most of the game reserves are located. Now we happen to be there in November and December, and in Zimbabwe, because you're in the southern hemisphere, that's spring. And so we should have rain. And now the rains are a little bit delayed, but things are greening up. And more importantly, there are a fair number of baby animals about. The zebra have been dropping, the monkeys have been giving birth, the impala babies are out, and the result is that the lions and cheetahs are happy as well. The lion cubs are here because this is the site of a lion kill. The lions have gotten together and killed themselves a wildebeest. And there are two adult females here guarding the animal, and one of them happens to be the mother of these 4 cubs. Kittens are so cute that I'm going to stay with them for a few seconds. But then we're going to be moving on to poaching. Poaching is a fairly serious subject in Africa, and there are 2 basic kinds. The first one they're going to be looking at is subsistence poaching. This kind of poaching is the poaching that the local people do in order to feed their families. And basically what they do is they don't go out with firearms or dogs or something. They'll instead usually set some sort of a trap. A wire trap is common, and frequently in order to get the wire, they will actually cut the boundary fence wire to the park and use that to create a snare. The animal steps into the snare and the snare tightens and the animal is suffocated. Although the group that I was with that were doing subsistence poaching reinforcement are not armed. The group that I'm with now is heavily armed. They have AK-47s with banana clips on them, so they can shoot lots of rounds. And they're intended to enforce against commercial poaching. And commercial poaching usually involves rhino or elephant. The rhino for the horn and the elephant for the tusk. In this particular case, these rhino are all white rhino, and their horns have been removed, which frankly makes them look ridiculous. As I suspect you know by now, the white rhino and the black rhino are actually the same color. The white rhino got its name out of the Afrikaans, and incidentally, this guy's got a bad attitude. He's a little bit suspicious of us, and we're going to have to watch him. Well, like I said, the white rhino got its name out of Afrikaans, and it's not really white that the Afrikaans were saying. In Afrikaans, it's wide. They're talking about the mouth. He's got that big flat muzzle, and the reason for that is because he's a grazer. The black rhino, on the other hand, is a browser, and he has more of a V-shaped lip at the end of his mouth. And that helps him to grab hold of branches and twigs. Black rhino also have a not so good attitude, so you have to be a little bit more careful with them. The white rhino are the second largest animals in Africa, the elephants being, of course, the largest. Except for the rhino that's on the far left that is out of the picture right now, the other rhino are pretty relaxed, comparatively speaking anyway. The white rhino is usually not nearly as aggressive as the black rhino, as I said, but they can't see very well. They can smell and they can hear, but if you approach them with the wind in your favor, they may not even detect you. Well, frankly, they have detected us, and even though the wind was in our favor, and they're watching this about as closely as they can. But when they get excited, they can charge in all directions at the same time because, like I said, their eyesight is not very good. Rhino are three-toed, like the tapir in South America and Southeast Asia. And the tapir and the rhino are both fairly closely related to the horse. The horse only has a single hoof, but at one time it did have 3 toes. Well, in response to our presence, the rhinoceros are increasing the distance between us and returning to grazing for the most part. So they're going to stay relaxed, but at a distance. Oh, and incidentally, I'm on foot with the anti-poaching patrol. The other target of commercial poaching, of course, is the elephant for the ivory. Now, Zimbabwe does not have a shortage of elephants. Frankly, if anything, they probably have too many. They have about a quarter of all of the African elephants in existence. Now this next guy is a dung beetle, also known as a scarab beetle, and he's rolling his treasure and his girlfriend to their new home. Notice he has to do it backwards and upside down. Next, this herd of wildebeest is moving on, and the kids are in a gallop behind them. But one of them got left behind, and he panics. Banded mongoose can be almost as much fun to watch as monkeys or kittens. But now let us return to our main story about the Matabele. Do you remember Cecil Rhodes, the king of diamonds? The guy that also wanted to discover the gold of Ophir? Well, eventually, he negotiated an agreement with the Matabele that would allow him to cross their land and go into the Shona land. And in that way, that's where the gold was, and he would establish prospectors there and settlers and so forth. He also planned to bring in a private army.
On your column, forward!
Now you might ask yourself, what did the Matabele get in return? Well, the chief of the Matabele, he got wealth, of course. That's to be expected. But he also got high-quality British rifles, the Martini Henrys, the same issue that the army would use at that time. And he got enough of them to arm 20,000 of his warriors with rifles. And he got tons of ammunition.
I have considered the existence of God and decided that there's a 50-50 chance that God exists. Therefore, I propose to give him the benefit of the doubt. Now, what would this God want of the world? He would want it well run. I have viewed the peoples of the world and have come to the conclusion that the English-speaking race has the highest ideals of justice, liberty, and peace. Therefore, I shall devote the rest of my life to God's purpose and make the world English. I shall work for the furtherance of the British Empire, the bringing of the whole civilized world under British rule, for the recovery of the United States of America, for the making of the Anglo-Saxon world into one empire. What a dream. Yet it is possible. It is probable.
Well, that brings us to the Matabele Wars. You did see that coming, didn't you? But let's start with Cecil Rhodes. He was born in England, but he was a sickly child, and his parents decided to send him to South Africa for his health. That was when he was a teenager. He eventually becomes the king of diamonds down there, And as you know, he develops an interest in Ophir. And he sends that pioneering column that we've already discussed into and across the Matabele land into Shona territory. Now, there is the problem. You see, Cecil Rhodes had negotiated agreements with just about everyone who wasn't a European in this area. And one of his agreements with the Shona was a mutual defense pact, so that if the Shona were attacked, Cecil Rhodes' company troops would come to their assistance. Well, the Shona are the traditional prey of the Matabele warriors. And the Matabele sent a raid up after cattle to steal them from the Shona. And the British did come to the Shona's assistance. And that starts off the first Matabele War. Some of the British were looking forward to this possibility, and troops from Fort Salisbury, which is where Harare is today, and Fort Victoria quickly combined and moved toward the Matabele capital at Bulawayo. In the meantime, additional troops were coming up from South Africa. The British column was attacked twice and beat back the Matabele both times, because the Matabele, although they had lots of rifles, they were lousy shots. In addition to that, the British had a secret weapon. They had Maxim machine guns. This is the first time that machine gun was ever used by the British on any battlefield anywhere, and it proved to be absolutely devastating to the Matabele, who charged in mass formations, ideal targets for machine guns. As a matter of fact, in one engagement, 50 company soldiers with just 4 maximum machine guns fought off 5,000 Matabele warriors. This is one of those cases where you can be outnumbered 100 to 1 and win. Lobengula, the king of the Matabele, quickly figured out which way this war was going and decided to immediately evacuate his capital, Bulawayo, which he did, and he took everything that he possibly could, but the ammunition was just too heavy and he couldn't take all of it. So he set fire to the capital so as to leave nothing behind. The fire, of course, caught the ammunition and caused a tremendous explosion. At some point into the retreat into the bush, Lobengula, the king of the Matabele, died. We're not sure just exactly why, but there was a smallpox epidemic going on at that time, and he might have died of smallpox. In pretty quick succession, the Matabele surrendered to the British. This is the point at which this country starts becoming Rhodesia. It was only about a year after the first Matabele War was over that the hostilities broke out again. The king had died. There wasn't any royal power, but there were witch doctors.
Grandpapa, we're ready to eat.
There was one in particular that's referred to as the Ilimu. And he was telling people, he was telling the Matabele, that his magic could turn Western bullets into water and artillery fire into eggshells. Well, that got everybody stirred up, and they began attacking the settlers. Now, of course, the settlers were on farms, they were in isolated positions, they were easily knocked off by the Matabele, and hundreds of people were killed. They weren't just killed, but women and children were killed, and their bodies mutilated, and it was a very bad thing. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that all of the savagery was on the side of the Matabele. I've got a quote from Cecil Rhodes that I'd like to read to you. And it has to do with something that occurred actually after the war was pretty much over, but something that shows that it was the British that were equally savage at this time. Cecil Rhodes once reprimanded a police officer in Matabele land in 1897 for sparing the lives of Matabele rebels who had pleaded for clemency, saying, quote, "You should not spare them. You should kill all you can, as it serves a lesson to them." They count up the killed, and they say so-and-so is dead, and so-and-so is no longer here, and they begin to fear you. We're going to be turning now to a very interesting American that was in southern Africa. I've been reading this book, Scouting on Two Continents, by Major Frederick Burnham. Now, Major Frederick Burnham was an American, but that major, that's a major in the British Army, not the American Army. Scouting on Two Continents, he started out life scouting against Indians, mostly Apaches. Of course, that was in the United States, and then he went to Southern Africa. And in Southern Africa, he worked with the British Army, scouting against Matabele, and also later on against the Boers. He met lots of interesting people. Queen Victoria for one, Teddy Roosevelt for another was a friend of his. He did all kinds of things. In addition to scouting, he also did gold prospecting in Africa and in the United States, in California. As a matter of fact, when he came back to California after scouting in Southern Africa, he struck oil and he ended life rich. But my favorite story about Frederick Burnham has to do with when he was an infant. You see, he was born on an Indian reservation, although neither he nor his parents were American Indians, a Sioux reservation as a matter of fact. And in this particular case, he was born near the Civil War. The Civil War was on at the time of this story, and that means that there were very few Union troops in the area. And the Sioux decided that this was an excellent time to go on the warpath. And the word spread amongst the European population of that area. And Fred's father went into town to buy extra ammunition because he knew he was vulnerable. While he was in town buying that extra ammunition, though, his wife saw some Sioux approaching their cabin, and they had war paint on. So she grabbed little Fred and she took off. Now, she knew she couldn't outrun the Indians with Fred, so she ditched Fred in a cornfield. The corn was green at the time. And she took off. And the Indians did come and they burned their cabin down, but they couldn't burn the cornfield down because it was green. So when Fred's mother came back, she found Fred happy as a clam just where she left him. Fred grew up with Indians, probably some of the same children whose father had burned down their cabin years ago. And he learned a great deal about scouting from them and from the other scouts that were being used by the Army at that time. One of the advantages that Fred has in talking about the Matabele is that he can compare the Matabele with the Apaches. And he says that the Apaches were much better trackers than the Matabele. And this makes a certain amount of sense because, after all, the Apaches made their living hunting. The Matabele did not. They were basically cattle raisers, ranchers. But that's not why I started reading about Major Burnham. Instead, it's his exploits in the Second Matabele War. In the Second War, you'll recall, the country of the Matabele was not ruled by a king anymore. There was a sort of interregnum. And in that power vacuum, what happened was the witch doctors basically took control. And they stirred the people up against the British. The Matabele began attacking the British because they thought that the witch doctors could make the British bullets turn into water and their artillery shells into eggshells. Well, of course that didn't happen, but the war was still going on. And Major Burnham and another person that's mentioned in this book were authorized to go out on an expedition to find the major witch doctor, the guy that was stirring up all the trouble. And they reported back that they located him, they found him in a cave, and they killed him. Now that wasn't too far away from a Matabele village, so they had to run like Dickens in order to get out of the Matabele territory. But nevertheless, Major Burnham says that killing that witch doctor basically ended the Second Matabele War. If Major Burnham's account of all of his exploits in his book are correct, he's the world's greatest scout. In the alternative, he's the world's greatest liar. I told you earlier a little bit about Frederick Burnham and his exploits here in Zimbabwe, or what is now Zimbabwe, at that time Rhodesia. And I have with me my guide, Paul, who's an expert on the Matabele Wars. Have I got that right, Paul?
Yes, you do. Thank you.
Okay, good. Now, as I understand it, Major Burnham and a friend of his, Armstrong, came out into this general area during the Second Matabele War, and they found the Inlimo, who was causing all the trouble for the settlers in the area that was generating the rebellion. They killed him in a cave nearby here someplace, and then they galloped away in order to escape from the Matabele. Have I got that right?
Well, as historians, we probably argue with some of the content of that. The idea that the Mlimo was the instigator of much of the unrest in this area was a contested one even in Burnham's time, and his exact identity was never accurately ascertained. Burnham and Armstrong certainly came out into this area and did kill someone that they thought was the Mlimo, but how they identified him so confidently is a bit of a mystery, because all we have to go on mainly is Burnham's own published account.
Oh, but with Burnham's account, it's obvious that the person was the Mlimo because he was in that sacred cave when they killed him. He was giving incantations. Isn't that proof, or some proof?
Well, there's a lot to unpack in that very simple sentence, but to keep it very short, today we don't think that the priests of the Mwali religion, which is spread out throughout the Matabele Hills, were the full leaders of the uprising against the whites and their rule at that time. So Burnham's story about leaping up into a cave and shooting someone in the midst of some arcane ritual is a very, very romantic account. And indeed, it was not corroborated by his partner Armstrong at the time in any form of writing. Burnham just would say, Armstrong agrees that this is what we did, and then moved on from it. What several later historians have actually managed to reveal is that it's unlikely Burnham ever went up even into a cave, and possibly shot a man in a field who was working in his fields at the time like that, because several other accounts of interviews of people done here in the 1920s, 1930s by early historians trying to follow in the footsteps here did not corroborate Burnham's story in the slightest.
Oh, but Burnham's story must be true, because the fact is that the war ended almost immediately after he killed the Mlimo.
Well, that was a neat editorial trick in Burnham's book, Scouting on Two Continents, because he makes it seem like, he kills the Mlimo, as he likes to put it, and then the war ended shortly after. And what he skips out on is the fact that he leaves Matabele land sometime in early July, and the war continued for another 2 months with intense fighting. And then towards late August of that year is when Cecil Rhodes takes a gamble and manages to make contact with the Ndebele leadership and begin to negotiate a peace, which takes another 2 months, September into October, before the war, at least in Matabele land, is over. And the war, as it continued much longer in Mashonaland, for over another year before that war was ended as well. So a little bit of creative editing there of the story, I would say.
Well, he killed someone. Is that correct?
I would believe so, yes. Because how we know that he came in here and killed someone is because there were actually protests from some of the Ndebele leadership who were neutrals in the war in this area at that point. You had incursions from other military groups at the time coming in here, but the main Induna or leader of the Ndebele in this area actually chose to be neutral for much of the war, eventually allying himself with the whites later on. And he actually makes a formal complaint to the administrator, who's the equivalent of the governor at that time, and says, we've just had someone just shot in our area. What's going on? Why are you attacking us? And there's several, days of worry, because they thought that might have pushed him over to joining with the rest of the Ndebele, but events swung the other way.
So Burnham's action didn't end the war, is that right?
He did not. He had a significant role as a scout and as a soldier throughout the early parts of the campaign, but that one action did nothing to actually bring the war to a quicker close.
That's all very, very interesting. I thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, if Frederick Burnham's actions didn't end the war, then Cecil Rhodes' actions almost certainly did. The war went on. It looked like it was going to be interminable, and it was costing a great deal of money, and I think that's one of the driving factors for Cecil Rhodes. It basically encouraged him to bravely go into the Matabele territory, into their heartland, and negotiate with their leaders on a very personal basis.
Amehlo amhlophe.
Yebo, amehlo amhlophe. Khosi wena umzingelo omkhulu.
Good. Shall we...
Is it peace?
Sihlangene ngokuthula na.
Yebo. Thina siza ngokuthula.
It is peace.
Now, after all that had happened, you might think that the Matabele held a grudge against Cecil Rhodes. But in fact, they held him in fairly high esteem. I'm going to be coming back to that later. But keep in mind, the Matabele did not dislike Cecil Rhodes. They trusted him. We're going to change our focus now to railroads. One of the first things that Cecil Rhodes wanted to do was to get a railroad up to Victoria Falls. The reason for that is obvious. Today, it's a huge tourist attraction, and it was even in his day.
It was Cecil Rhodes who dreamt of a bridge across the Zambezi, where the trains as they pass will catch the spray of the falls. Opened in 1905, the bridge was hailed as a man-made engineering wonder to rival the natural beauty of the falls themselves. Today, the bridge is...
But of course, I'm not visiting the falls by rail. I'm using a helicopter. Right now, the Zambezi River is kind of at a low water level. That actually helps you to see the falls, because when the falls are at full water level and huge amounts are coming down, usually in March or so, what you see is very little, because there's so much spray coming up from all the water dropping down into that crack in the ground, that you really can't see the falls at all. So this is, in many ways, the best view at the best time of year for Victoria Falls. Here we spy some local residents headed for the river. He's also the person that came up with the idea of a Cape Town to Cairo railway. That is, a railway that went all the way across Africa from north to south. And the British came very close to achieving that objective. The British occupied territory virtually all the way from Cape Town to Cairo. The big exception was German East Africa, but Cecil Rhodes was able to negotiate with the Germans and get a right-of-way for the railroad. And, of course, after World War I, the Brits also occupied what was German East Africa. We're moving on now to visit the railway car that was Cecil Rhodes' personal railway car. Yes, he had his own, and used it quite extensively for travel. The railway carriage that I'm in right now used to belong to Cecil Rhodes. I've talked about him already, so you know about Cecil Rhodes. And what I'm going to do is I want to take you through his carriage and show you some of the rooms that are in here. I think it's very interesting. So will you follow me in and we'll take a look. It's a little bit tight in here, but there's an awful lot that Cecil packed into this carriage. This carriage was actually constructed in a sense, that is, the materials were assembled in the United States and then broken down and brought by ship to South Africa and reassembled. The wood that's in here, I've been told, is a Burmese teak. And this spot right here has actually been changed since Cecil Rhodes was here. I want you to look down, if you can, with me, and you'll see a metal plate here with a hole in it. Do you see the metal plate with the hole? There used to be a bed here, and the bed just kind of stood up, and that was the hinge that allowed the bed to come down and for Cecil Rhodes to sleep in the bed. I'm going to move over to the bathroom now. This is the sink that he would have used, and as we go through, I want you to take a look at the bathtub, and then we'll move on further back. Okay, now this part of the carriage is actually for any guests that Cecil Rhodes might happen to have. Now if you look down here, you can see that the seats have been rearranged so that there could be a bed here. And over here, the seats are arranged as seats, but of course they could also be turned into a bed. In addition, on both sides, you've got beds that could come down off of the wall. And so the result is he could have 4 guests in here at a time. I'm going to move further on back. This room in here is where the cook would have lived. He's the most important person in the carriage. And now we've gotten all the way to the end of the carriage. And this is where the kitchen is. The oven is here. There are warming boxes up here. And over on the other side, this is the sink where the cook would clean things up. Okay. After the wars were over, Cecil Rhodes was also responsible for setting up the Rhodes Scholarship. This is the one where people that eventually became prime ministers of Canada, Australia, Malta, and even Bill Clinton picked up Rhodes Scholarships. That's where that comes from. We're back up in the Matopos area, the area that was the heartland, or the spiritual land, if you will, of the Matabele. And you can tell it's a Matopo because of all those hills with rocks on the top of it. That's characteristic of this particular area. It happens that this is my lodge, in fact, my specific room in the Matopos. You can tell that it is different from the rocks around it because there is a thatched roof there that you can make out. But it's amongst those rocks so that it blends in perfectly with the rest of the scenery. There's one particular hill called the Hill of Benevolent Spirits. Well, at least in English it is. And that's where Cecil Rhodes wanted to be buried. He said in his last will and testament, "I admire the grandeur and loneliness of the Matopos in Rhodesia, and therefore I desired to be buried in the Matopos on the hill which I used to visit and which I called a view of the world." In a square to be cut in the rock on the top of the hill, covered with a plain brass plaque with the words thereon, "Here lie the remains of Cecil John Rhodes." Well, on the 10th of April, 1902, Rhodes' coffin was embedded in this particular place. And it's generally referred to as a haunt of the ancestral spirits by the local people. The Ndebele chiefs were at the ceremony, and they requested that guns not be fired at the funeral, as tradition dictates, because it would disturb the spirits of this vicinity. They sent him on his way with the Ndebele royal salute, Bayete. Later residents of Zimbabwe have often been considerably less kind. It has been popular for some time for people to criticize Cecil Rhodes for things that he said that were, well, frankly, not politically correct. Usually when someone does or says things like that today, we go back and we say, well, that person was a man of his times. That is, everybody believed essentially what he did, and he was no better and no worse. But in Cecil Rhodes' case, you can't really say that, because he was widely criticized for his opinions in his day.